A bit like going to your first swingers party, the Microbrand watch space can be an intimidating place, even for an enthusiast. It's a bit like the vintage watch space. There are do's and don'ts, and there always seem to be more don'ts than do's. But as someone with a passing interest in the scene, here is why I think you should buy a Microbrand, and more specifically, why I think you should probably buy a Nodus Duality. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel so that I can one day afford to buy a good quality Venetian mask and finally go to a party like that one from Eyes Wide Shut. Done it? Okay, sweet. Now where's my sex cape? Unlike the vintage watch scene, there aren't quite as many pitfalls with the Microbrand one, at least when it comes to the maintenance of your watch. It's likely going to be equipped with a modern movement, which we'll get into in more detail a bit later, and they're also likely to be styled so as not to suffer from one of my own issues with vintage watches, the proportions. I like to know the dimensions before I fall hard for a watch that would be unwearable on my Lego man wrist, so let's start there. The Nodus Duality comes in at 40mm with a 48mm lug to lug, and the case height, including that insanely heavily domed sapphire crystal, measures 13mm, but just look at that thing! And the lug width is a crowd pleasing 20mm. It tapers down to 18mm and then back up to 21mm at the clasp. These dimensions will be music to the ears of enthusiasts, and that's my first reason to buy a Microbrand. It'll cater to enthusiasts. It's very much the OnlyFans of the watch industry. The dimensions on the Duality will work on almost any wrist, so you can rest easy if you've got what I'm going to call wrist anxiety. Onto the technical side of things, and unlike modern Britain, Microbrands can benefit from, let's say, freedom of movement. Basically the upside to not having an in-house movement. It'll come with a movement that any watchmaker worth his or her salt will be able to service, whether it's a Miyota, Seiko, Sellita, Etta, Ronda, or whatever other movement maker that they use. Nodus have opted for the Miyota 9015 in this instance, a high-beat Japanese automatic movement with a roughly 42-hour power reserve and a date function that's been well integrated here at 6 o'clock. I particularly like the framing of the date in this case, being polished like the indices and fitting in well with the aesthetics. The movement itself is regulated by Nodus, and this one is running very well indeed. They even provide a nice card to tell you how your watch should be running straight from the factory when you get it. That personal touch is the third reason to buy a Microbrand. You have a very direct relationship between you the customer and them the seller, and you're usually talking with the brand owner when you do message or email the company. You just get a deeper appreciation of the brand because it feels more like a personal relationship. Speaking of depth, we get a sandwich dial on the Duality, giving the name yet another layer of meaning. The watch is 300 meters water resistant though, so you needn't worry about going too deep, as I've been told plenty of times in various contexts. The indices are polished nicely, as are the hands. The indices are kind of pencil shaped, with double batons at 12 and single batons at 3 and 9. They're generously filled with BGW9, while there are small accents of what Nodus call green glowing lume elsewhere on the dial. So those accents aren't C3 superluminova, but this own brand lume does a good job of showing off some contrast on that triangle on the inner rotating bezel and the two screw down crowns. As every misguided pilot has said whilst flying towards Bermuda, let's get into this triangle. It glows green, and it does rotate courtesy of it being on the inner rotating bezel. You unscrew the crown at 2 o'clock or thereabouts, and then you can actually set the inner rotating bezel to track a second time zone. Nodus offer the Duality with both the travel style 1 to 12 markers that I have here, or with traditional dive time markers. I don't travel as often as I'd like, and I haven't dived since I had to escape the cockpit of a sinking 747 off the coast of the aptly named British Virgin Islands. But the inner rotating bezel makes this watch more of a conversation starter than a traditional dive watch might. Saying that, if your opening line to a conversation is, "Don't you think this inner rotating bezel makes this more interesting than traditional dive watch?" then you've probably got bigger problems than I can help you with. The only downside of this is that it can be fiddly to get it to align when you're screwing it back in. So if you're a bit OCD about that kind of thing, then this might be a bit of an annoyance. The 316L stainless steel that the watch is constructed of is brushed throughout, except for some nice chamfering along the edges of the case back, and on the rounded bezel. As you've probably guessed, I didn't get this new, and that's my final reason to buy a Microbrand. Value retention. Okay, these things won't hold value like a Rolex, but they won't lose so much value that you ever regret having bought it. There are brands like Nodus, Zelos, Monta, and more that have loyal followings online, and you'll more than likely be able to sell on a watch if it doesn't click with you, or just trade it for something that does. This model costs $700 or £500, and for that price, I'm not going to be too disappointed if I lose, say, £100 or so on it. I do have a few nitpicks with this watch, however, and it starts with the clasp. You see, sizing up the bracelet is a dream thanks to the screw pins, but the micro adjustments are basically redundant as the bracelet is just a bit too wide for the clasp. It's simply wedged in there and it won't budge. I've taken it to a watchmaker and they haven't been able to move it either. Luckily I've got a perfect fit for my just over 6-inch wrists, so it's not a big issue for me personally, but something to bear in mind. Thankfully, it also comes with a very good quality rubber strap, complete with signed Nodus hardware, and the rubber is fantastic. It doesn't pick up any lint or dust like cheaper rubber straps that I've tried to. It also contours really well to the wrist, and the tongue of the strap sits extremely flush, and that means that you don't get the sort of flappiness that puts me off using straps of basically any material over a bracelet. Threading the crown isn't as smooth as it should be for the price, especially considering there are watches that cost far less than this one and have better crown actions. Although saying that, I do love the knurling on each crown, it's fantastic, and I really like the fact that they've been done in black, making them stand out but also paradoxically blend in with the colour scheme of the watch. Finally, the inner rotating bezel is a nice novelty for one's collection, but as you probably saw, and as at least 2 women could attest to, I find it tricky to get it screwed in and to line up satisfactorily. Eventually I do get it, but by the time that I do, everyone will just be left a bit frustrated and deflated. That goes for the watch too. However, they're just minor gripes about a watch that is, ultimately, excellent, and it offers the chance to have a unique looking piece at a very reasonable price, which could probably be considered the raison d'etre of any good Microbrand. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed looking at this watch. I've left a link to their website below, but as you can probably imagine, the brand haven't asked me to do that or anything, and I'm certainly not an ambassador they probably want to associate with. On the other hand, if you're watching, hey, slide into my DMs. If you've got any suggestions for cool Microbrands you think I should look at, let me know in the comments. Please do subscribe and like the video, as it means we feed that greedy YouTube algorithm. See you next time.